Afternoon, everybody. So I'm Lisa Kenny with the Greater Buffalo Niagara Regional Transportation Council, which is the metropolitan planning organization in the Buffalo area. And I work as a smart mobility advisor here. So work on a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about today and how to get our municipalities ready for it. So before I turn it over to our speakers, I just want to give a bit of background in terms of motivation for this session. As probably most of you know, if you're here today in this session, e-bikes and e-scooters are now legal in New York State, and we'll talk a bit more about what that means. And I think especially what that means for planners, and especially those of us outside of New York City, where it's really just a very different operating environment. We'll give a sense of, regulations, what can and should municipalities be doing in terms of where e-bikes, e-scooters can ride, could park, do we need age limits, speed limits? Is there particular special infrastructure that's needed, utility hookups for charging stations? And then how do we ensure that these options are accessible to communities of color, low-income communities, people with limited English skills, and people with disabilities or other mobility challenges. And so today we've got 4 great panelists, and we'll hear a bit about micromobility writ large, e-micromobility, what's been going on in some other places across the country, and then get a sense of what is being started to be done here in New York State, and kind of what we might want to be doing as next steps. So as Dan mentioned, if you have questions during the presentations, just throw them into the Q&A box, and I'll try and do my best to monitor those. Otherwise, we'll have plenty of time at the end if you have questions, for any of the specific speakers or just more broadly. So with that, I'll introduce our speaker really briefly, and then I'll let them talk about themselves more. But first, we'll have Les Brown from ICF, and then Jen Saponis from the Capital District Transportation Council in Albany, then Neil Burke from the city of Syracuse, and last but not least, Mitch LaRosa from Shared Mobility, Inc., which is based here in Buffalo, but doing work in lots of different places these days. So with that, I will turn it over to Les. And feel free to introduce yourself a bit more or less, and go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to New York Upstate APA for hosting me. The goal of my presentation today is to kind of give a broad overview of why this topic is of special importance to planners, especially given recent changes in regulations at the state level. So I'm going to be diving in on a broad array of topics, but specifically focusing on where the industry is at and the relation of this topic to key planning goals as it relates to potential decision making. So a bit about myself. I'm a transportation planner and policy analyst at ICF. I work for the New York State DOT as a shared mobility and innovative mobility advisor. So I advise at the state level, and then also more locally in regions such as the Hudson Valley, and have advised upstate as well. So I've met some of you through that role. I'm also currently serving as the project manager for FTA's Mobility Innovation Demonstration Program evaluation, so a total of 60 demonstrations. But I kind of cut my teeth in this industry in active transportation, so walking and biking in the advocacy world. And so this is a topic that's always been near and dear to my heart. Try to work in this area whenever I can. So as I stated earlier, the agenda is to kind of define what is micromobility, look at the evolution of micromobility, as well as some current trends and some trends that have shaped the industry, and then the relation of micromobility to things like mobility, sustainability, equity, accessibility, and safety, and then to think about how this impacts decision making relative to planning principles. And policy decision making. So in this section, I'll go through defining micromobility, looking at the evolution, the trends of the vehicle form factors and how those have changed over time, looking at ridership trends, ridership forecasts, especially given recent disruptions of COVID-19. So what is micromobility? Depends on who you ask, but according to SAE, who some of you might be familiar with, it's a standards body, formerly Society of Automotive Engineers. It's vehicles less than or equal to 500 pounds, less than or equal to 30 miles per hour, and less than 5 feet wide, which is kind of a wonky definition, but I included this graphic just to show what types of vehicles we're talking about. And kind of the key criteria here are weight, speed, and size. So it's kind of a broad umbrella term. There's no one single definition, but these are the types of things that define what micromobility is. And I like to show this chart here, which tracks the evolution of micromobility over time. Going back to 2007 with the debut of modern station-based bike share in Paris, and then the release of the debut of Capital Bike Share in DC in 2010, and we kind of saw a host of other micromobility companies come into play. I think it really took off in about 2015 or so in China, actually, and that's where dockless bike share first debuted. And then within the following couple of years, you saw the arrival of Bird in Los Angeles with the free-floating e-scooters we're also familiar with today. And with Jump in San Francisco also in 2017. So that was kind of a banner year for that industry. And kind of since that time, we've seen various iterations of existing vehicles. We've seen shared mopeds take off with companies like Revel. And in the past 2 years, we've seen the rise of adaptive vehicles and higher speed vehicles that go up to 30 miles per hour. And then this year, we've seen the release of remote operated scooters to assist with rebalancing of fleets, and connected or quote unquote smart scooters, which use predictive analytics and all sorts of technology to onboard sensors to kind of notify fleet managers of when vehicles need attention. And this is just a quick image of what the more recent evolution of the vehicle trends look like. You see these adaptive vehicles here and remote operated and smart scooters at the bottom. You can see the remote operated one kind of has training wheels, so somebody can operate it on the fly and it doesn't tip over. And then the e-bike pictured here is one that's capped at 30 miles per hour. So it's 10 miles per hour faster than what we see on the roads today. And there's kind of a loophole in the California law that allows for that. So New York State, I don't think that would be legal, but we're starting to see vehicles like these in other states. And Revel, as you may have heard, was recently banned in New York City after or suspended in New York City after some crashes, but it has taken off and grown in other cities across the US and throughout Europe as well. So I'm not gonna stay on this graphic. I realize this is an eyeful, but this is just a resource if for any reason you would want to know who all the players in the micromobility landscape are. When we talk about micromobility, we're really thinking about these guys, Bird, Lime, Lyft, and so forth, but there's a whole array of supporting companies. And so this company micromobility.io publishes and updates this landscape, which kind of tellingly has grown from about 150 players in 2019 to something like 400 today. So it's somewhat reflective of how fast this industry is growing. Although with COVID-19, there's definitely been some consolidation, but the overall trend has been rapid growth. So I'll touch on COVID-19 impacts in a little bit. So in terms of ridership trends, you can see they were fairly stable year over year growth from 2010 to 2017 when I when we had the arrival of the scooter companies and the private micromobility industry. You can see a big jump here in 2013 when City Bike was introduced in New York City. And you can see this really substantial jump when scooter share was introduced throughout the country in 2018. And it really grew exponentially last year as well. This is data from National Association of City Transportation Officials to get to 136 million trips nationally. So it's grown substantially. But as you might imagine, it also took quite a nosedive as a result of COVID-19. So in the short term, there's been 60 to 70% decline in ridership among these services. This is from a report that McKinsey published in July. And they forecast, however, that the market for mobility for micromobility will be pretty strong through the coming years, and they give a variety of reasons for that, such as reluctance to get back into crowded public transit vehicles. So the long-term forecast seems to be good. The short-term forecast has led to some industry consolidation, such as Jump Bike was recently sold to Lime, I believe it was, and Zagster was recently bought up by another company. So some of these long-time players in the industry have recently consolidated. So turning to the relationship of micromobility to planning goals, just start off by naming some potential uses of micromobility. Definitely not a totally inclusive list, but increasing access to opportunities, goods, and services for short distance trips. Typically, we're talking 1 to 3 miles. Similarly, first and last mile transit connections, getting people to and from bus and fixed guideway transit stations, and particularly for folks who live within a mile or two of those stations, providing active and non-polluting alternatives to short driving trips, and providing recreational options. So in terms of the mobility impacts of these services, I've kind of divided it here into scooters and e-bikes, which are the two main categories of vehicles. So this data comes from a 2018 study by the Portland Bureau of Transportation, looking at 700,000 trips in that agency's pilot. And the report found that 71% were used for kind of utilitarian purposes and 29% for recreation, and the average scooter trip was 1.5 miles. In terms of mode shifts, 34% replaced driving trips. That includes both personal vehicles and things like Uber and Lyft trips. 14% replaced personal vehicle trip, and 45% replaced walking or biking. So it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of mode shift. And in terms of vehicle miles traveled replacement, those 700,000 trips, Portland Bureau of Transportation found replaced an equivalent of 300,000 passenger vehicle miles, or 27 passenger vehicles a year. Trip characteristics for e-bikes, this came from a study by Portland State University, and they showed that, and this is not an apples to apples comparison, but 9.4% of e-bike trips, these are personally owned e-bikes, were utilitarian, much longer in length, and 62% of these personally owned e-bike trips replaced trips otherwise taken by car. So again, not an apples to apples comparison, but gives you a sense of how these things impact mobility. In terms of sustainability, early on, these services were pitched as being very green, and good for the environment, but some of the early life cycle emissions assessments kind of concluded otherwise, especially for the first generation scooters. So there's a North Carolina state study that said shared e-scooters are net positive for the environment if replacing car trips, otherwise not so much. And that's accounting for the whole cradle to grave cycle of these scooters, from the raw materials and manufacturing through the operations and the use and the disposal and the infrastructure. So there were some early studies using some Freedom of Information Act data, because this data is often not made publicly available, that found in Louisville among these first generation scooters that they had a lifespan as low as 28.8 days. You know, the scooter companies have since improved on that, but the vehicle lifespan and the life cycle emissions assessment is something you really got to keep in mind here. There's also, you know, with the recent industry consolidations, there's also this question of the sustainability of the industry itself. You know, there were some contractions, and there were some contractions in the broader shared mobility industry amongst Uber and Lyft, and you saw their kind of stocks take a nosedive over the past year when some of the venture capital pressure started turning into this pressure to turn a profit. So you're seeing a similar thing in this industry now, and so there's kind of been a right sizing of the industry that's occurred and will likely continue to occur, but the forecast is positive at this point long term. This is a recent study by the International Transport Forum. It compares emissions of micromobility to passenger vehicles and to public transit. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I just drew this dashed line here to show where the micromobility modes, which you can see here, fall with respect to traditional internal combustion engine buses. So you could see that shared e-bike is a little less emission intensive, and private bike is really the winner. Shared e-scooters are a little more emissions intensive, and as you can see from this blue bar, a lot of that has to do with the operational services. So these are things like rebalancing and charging that account for some of this extra emissions of the scooters. But you can see the new generation of scooters have a slightly smaller environmental footprint than the older ones. In terms of equity and accessibility, I included this graphic here from a 2018 study done by Populous in Washington, D.C. Hopefully this is not too small for you to see, but at the time, the scooters were limited to operating, scooters and bikes were limited to operating in the borders of Washington, D.C., which roughly correspond with the darker colored areas here, compared to Capital Bike Share, which is a regional system. And you could see it kind of has these fingers extending out. But what's notable here is that these dockless bikes and scooters filled some of the gaps that you see here. So there's potential to serve currently underserved areas. And then other issues to consider in terms of equity and accessibility are the discounts these vendors offer for eligible users. Those include discounts for users currently enrolled in or eligible for state or federal assistance programs, and those vary from company to company. However, in this Portland Bureau of Transportation study, amongst the 700,000 rides, it's notable that only 43 Portlanders enrolled in these low-income plans. So that's something to keep in mind about how these options are being made available to potential users. There's also the distributional consideration, and various municipalities have required that a certain percentage of vehicles be distributed throughout underserved neighborhoods as a condition of their RFP process. And then there's also accessibility. As I showed you before, there's more and more adaptive vehicles that are becoming available through these companies. And cities like Portland and Chicago have required and worked with focus groups to figure out what the needs for these communities are, and to kind of develop appropriate requirements for those vehicles through their RFP processes. So that means I'm out of time, but also, if it's okay, Lisa, I'll just take another a minute to go through my last slides here. So this is just a back of the envelope safety comparison I put together this was in 2019, and this was before a lot of the national and international studies have come out. But you know, the upshot is that a lot of this safety data is anecdotal. You know, with station-based bike share, there's open data requirements, and there's relationships between the bike share vendors and the cities. So this data is more transparent, the same with things like NHTSA data. But, you know, these figures, take them with a grain of salt, but I feel like the industry generally feels confident that station-based bike share has shown to be extremely safe, surprisingly so. That surprised a lot of people, myself included, when I was working on promoting the adoption of City Bike in 2013. Shared e-scooters, by comparison, I again take these numbers with a grain of salt, but they are more dangerous according to these numbers. But there are some positive news. This was some data from 2 micromobility providers, and they show the overall trend for e-scooter crashes reported per billion trips. And so you see they've declined quite a bit, and experience is an important factor there, as this chart suggests. And finally, in surveying users as to what's important in terms of safety, the users say protected bike lanes, smoother pavement, wider bike lanes, designated parking, city staff to cite bad parking. So this has probably not come as a big surprise, but important things to consider as you're thinking about the arrival of micromobility in your area. And then finally, the considerations for planning and policy. I like this radar diagram from New Urban Mobility Alliance, which just gets at this idea of the footprint of these vehicles, both in terms of their actual physical footprint, but their environmental footprint, their footprint on public health. So these are things to keep in mind, and New Urban Mobility Alliance has also developed a set of 10 policy principles that I would suggest you check out. So that's available on their website, and I'm not going to go through them because I'm out of time, but thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Les. And I'll just have Jen take the screen over and hand it over to her. Thanks.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, it looks good.
My screen? Okay, great. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Les. So I'm going to talk about what planners, particularly here in New York, can do to prepare for new shared electrified mobility. I'm a senior planner with the Capital District Transportation Committee, or CDTC. Just to briefly go over what we are, I've worked at CDTC since 2008. CDTC is a metropolitan planning organization, or an MPO. It's required by federal transportation legislation for metropolitan areas with a population of 50,000 or more. CDTC was established in 1964. It includes 4 counties and 77 municipalities. Within there are actually 8 cities, which makes us pretty unique. We're multinodal with those 4 medium-sized cities and 4 smaller cities. Our population is under 1 million, and we have 2 metropolitan areas within our MPO jurisdiction. So as Les explained, bike and car sharing and other shared mobility services are not particularly new. They came to New York State in the 2000s and have really started a transportation revolution. So this map isn't 100% accurate right now, but it does show that there are a number of different combinations of shared mobility services operating throughout New York. Here in the Capital District, we have multiple shared mobility services, including a regional bike share system that rolled out in 2018 and is managed by our transit agency. But CDTC played a big role in planning and cultivating stakeholders' relationships to move our shared mobility programs forward. So just like traditional shared mobility services, e-bikes and scooters are a tool to achieving a lot of our local, regional, and statewide planning goals related to resiliency, greenhouse gas emission reduction, active transportation, air quality, equity, and more. E-bikes and scooters expand mobility and access to older adults, people experiencing a mobility impairment or living with a disability. They replace more car trips because they flatten out hills and help us travel further and faster and with less exertion. And of course, are zero emission. So if they're replacing car trips, they reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So like we said, they have been prohibited in New York, which is why we haven't seen these devices. So the New York State Legislature recently passed legislation as part of the 2020 state budget that paves the way for them to be deployed across the state, but with some regulation. So the bill creates 3 different classes of e-bikes. Class 1 are pedal assist bikes like the city bike e-bikes, and they max out at 20 miles per hour. Class 2 are throttle powered e-bikes, also max out at 20. And then there are speed pedal assisted electric bikes that have a motor, and they max out at about 25 miles per hour. So other stuff in the bill, e-scooters will not be allowed in Manhattan. The devices are not treated the same and do not have the same rights and responsibilities as traditional bikes. So as we plan for them, we need to consider some of these regulations. For safety measures, we're cap the speed at 15 miles per hour for e-scooters. Class 1 and 2 e-bikes will require helmets for, I guess, 17 and under. And helmets are required for everyone on class 3 e-bikes. There are fines for riding while intoxicated. They're banned from roads with speed limit over 30 on certain trails down in New York City. But local governments can create their own e-bike and scooter legislation to overrule some provisions in the bill. One of these considerations is speed. So most streets outside the urban core are posted at 40 miles per hour or more. There are bike facilities on some of these types of roads. It's an example of a local road here in outside of Albany that was just road dieted, and there's a buffered bike lane, and they reduced the speed limit, but it's still over 30 miles per hour. Developing speed reduction plans and working with DOTs and counties and others to evaluate the feasibility of reducing speed limits if there are roads or corridors that are important to your local bike network should be explored. This isn't necessarily super easy, but and just reducing the speed limit won't necessarily reduce driving speed. It needs to be accompanied by engineering and enforcement measures, but this is one solution to that problem. Other opportunities for local governments to extract the most benefits from e-mobility is by establishing local regulations and creating a framework for the implementation of a successful program. So first, it's important to be able to communicate the benefits of e-mobility and how it will help your community achieve its goals. Being one of the last states to implement a program, we've heard about some of the negatives and some of the problems that other cities have had, but also this is a benefit because we can mitigate some of the problems and be proactive instead of reactive. One interesting thing that I kept on seeing was scooters were deployed across the country, were complaints about parking and littering sidewalks. There was a recent study of 8 cities that looked at vehicle and scooter parking and found that about 1% of scooters were parked incorrectly and about 27% of cars were parked incorrectly. So really kind of weeding out perception versus reality. Obviously safety is huge, but safety, the more facilities, infrastructure, enforcement, the safer the programs will be. Without this foresight, many programs across the country were quickly halted as they were implemented. So as planners, our goal should be to implement a successful program by planning ahead and being prepared for problems. So like Lisa talked about, kind of the trend was that e-bikes or scooters were deployed, there was some negative feedback or a safety related event. The bikes or scooters were banned, usually scooters. There was public backlash to that. And then some cities did pursue pilot programs to bring it back in a better managed way. Some responded by committing to building more infrastructure and developing more regulations. So for program success, there's a collection of supportive elements needed to be sustainable. A program must revolve around short trips and safety. But these are the main elements that cities need to address when planning for micromobility. the where, the location and placement of infrastructure, and the how, regulation and enforcement. So part of the work I have been doing with the New York State Association of MPOs Climate Change Working Group is tracking shared mobility programs and compiling plans as well as regulatory language. So there's generally 5 categories of regulations that cities can implement. I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, but I just wanted to highlight some important types. Designating space where e-bikes and scooters can operate is essential. They must be signed, and this must be well communicated. So I'm not sure being super limiting is helpful, but we must identify places where there are potential conflicts. Narrow sidewalks, high pedestrian areas, festival or marketplace areas aren't conducive to bikes, let alone e-bikes and scooters. Bikes are generally prohibited from sidewalks in most of New York anyway, but there may be other crowded or overused trails or other facilities that might be inappropriate for these devices. Prohibiting e-bikes or scooters is one way to deal with that, or posting a speed limit, because speed really is the issue in the conflict between the speed of an e-bike or e-scooter users and pedestrians and other users. So avoiding those areas is important. Stations and parking, they must be ubiquitous, just like a regular shared bike share system. The network needs to cover most origin and destination points. They all must be within walking distance of each other, because if there's no bikes one place, you need to be able to walk to the next station. And being co-located with transit and other transportation service is really essential. And because we want these 2 systems to complement each other, transit and shared mobility, and not compete with each other. So Les talked about first and last mile connections. NACTO survey found that most people, use devices to get to and from work, but also to connect to transit. A bike master plan might be a helpful tool for planning a shared network, but if your city doesn't have one, you can start by mapping existing facilities and activity generators. Similar to here in the capital region, many upstate cities and towns are still lacking in extensive bike infrastructure. So if you don't have infrastructure measuring traffic stress to identify roadways for future improvements is a good right now solution. But shared mobility is kind of a chicken and egg situation, right? So some communities might not want to launch a system until they have a developed network, but other communities have found that if they launch a system, communities follow by building facilities. And to echo what Les said, developing and mapping out a system must be done through an equity lens. Otherwise, people in neighborhoods are excluded from the system's benefits. So e-mobility can provide access to opportunities. And we've seen shared mobility. As we've seen shared mobility expand, we've also seen groups like older adults, low-income individuals, rural communities, and minority communities excluded from access. And sometimes the access is physical or geographic, but often it's also because of a lack of internet access, smartphones, or bank services. So we need to find ways to serve these populations. Infrastructure and parking locations and their design are important. Cities must designate areas for bike and scooter parking to keep pedestrian zones clear and avoid street litter or clutter that can make it more difficult for people with disabilities or mobility impairments to navigate space. So we see here some good and bad examples of parking in the public right of way. If you don't have space on the sidewalk, you can always reallocate on-street parking spaces for bikes and scooters. You see here, there is wide sidewalks and plenty of space, but other places you might have a poorly placed bike rack and the bike intrudes into the walking area. Those are things that you definitely want to avoid. So shared mobility, particularly e-bikes and scooters, expand access to more choices to more people. However, as these programs have rapidly expanded, and they continue to expand, we have to keep in mind that there are still people excluded if the system doesn't include adaptive devices. So an adaptive bike share pilot, a couple have been launched in different cities like San Francisco and Portland, Oregon. And what they've done is they partner with local organizations and a bike shop that serve the disabled community by matching riders with the appropriate adaptive device, like a tricycle or hand cycle, for recreational round trip rides. And then they help people get into their device and watch over their belongings. So scaling up to a one-way shared service isn't easy, but cities around the US are working on it. A first step to working on making a more inclusive system, of course, is raising awareness through these pilots. So this is just shows an example of a user in the Oakland Adaptive Bike Share pilot using a recumbent bike, and it even has space for her service dog. So other elements that planners may not directly play a role in shaping, but can facilitate or influence is mobility integration and safety education and outreach. So there are a number of operational models working for shared mobility services. Working closely with whoever the operator are is important. Cities can set up a permit or a fee system to collect revenues from private operators or take the fines, and they can go into infrastructure funds. Transit agencies are really important partners, as well as other mobility services, and make sure that you are developing connection. And you know, as mobility moves into a service, we need to make sure that people can have that seamless trip, can walk to a bike share station, ride their bike to the bus and get to work. And then maybe while they're at work, they have access to a car share vehicle. And maybe all that can be done within the same RFID card or the same app, smartphone app, but all of that can only be done through coordination. So similarly, working with local agencies and organizations on education and outreach through events and pilot projects and other strategies is important. Law enforcement must also be brought on board and play a soft role in safety education and traffic enforcement. So shared mobility, especially e-mobility with e-bikes and e-scooters and other evolving technologies, are constantly changing, and we don't know what direction it's heading or where it will be in 5 or 10 years. Everything is pretty uncertain. So as planners, we need to make small steps, test ideas, and reevaluate regularly. I work for an MPO, so our major product and centerpiece to our program is a 20-year regional plan, but we've recognized the need to reassess and update plans more regularly because of the rapid change in technology, the nature of our economy, so much other uncertainty. And now we're tracking mobility trends with COVID and how that might change things. So really continuing to assess, try pilots is really important. So there are many great resources and helpful guidance on shared mobility, the NACTO website, the Shared Use Mobility Center, and also we've created a page on the New York State MPO Association website where you can find links to resources and to regulation language and other information.
Great, thanks, Jen. And I'll just have Neil take the screen over for you. Thanks.
Okay, so quick tech check. Can you hear me?
Yep.
And you can see the screen?
Yep, looks good.
All right. So I'm Neil Burke. I'm the City of Syracuse transportation planner, overseeing all things ped, bike, multimodal, transportation, and land use. Working with the planning department, public works department, and anyone else who will take my phone calls. So, of course, the city's bike share program ends up on my desk, but that was by design. So you heard from Les about sort of the national scale, where these things stand. You heard from Jen about the MPO, the regional scale, and I'm going to take you in now to the municipal scale and just walk you through what our experience here in Syracuse has been with e-mobility, with our bike share. And you're going to see a lot of the same themes here, or hear a lot of the same things that both the previous two presenters touched on. But with a slightly different lens. So City of Syracuse, most of you are probably somewhat familiar with us. We're right in the center of New York State, just a hair under 150,000 people within the city limits. And we have one supplier of our bike share program, and it is operated by a third party at the request and via contract with the City of Syracuse. So just a broad overview here, some of the background items. We started this process in 2017. And when I say we, I mean a local nonprofit started digging around at what other cities and what other regions were doing, just in terms of shared mobility, not necessarily e-bikes or e-mobility, but just shared mobility in general. That community partner was Adapt CNY. They're a local nonprofit. They're involved in civic engagement, public arts, transportation, all the good things you want to hear. So when they came to us, the city, and said, hey, what do you think about our plans here? What do you think about this idea? We thought it was great. We're more than happy to co-sign on someone else's hard work, especially when it's good work as well. So we got together in short order with Adapt and developed our RFP. Technically, it was an RFQ. But there were a few main items that we knew we wanted out of any applicant, and we wanted the system to be operated by a third party without funding. So we wanted this to essentially be plug and play on someone else's behalf, which sounds great. We weren't sure if we could get that, but we asked for it in our RFQ anyways. And we wanted to make sure that when we're talking about the public right of way and someone in a private company making private dollars off the public right of way, we want to make sure that there was something in it for us as well. Now, adding to our transportation options is great. Yeah, I would sign on the dotted line twice for that. But in terms of getting the city council on board, they wanted to know and see some guarantees that there was some benefit here, long-term benefits for the city. So, and that's in the form of equipment fees and revenue sharing. And eventually we selected Gotcha Bike, who was our standout applicant. They mailed us a bike unknowingly to us, and we had counselors and city officials riding this bike share bike around inside City Hall. It was a trip. It was a sight to be seen. That's not the only reason they won. We really liked their equipment, the back end, the data, everything that they were showing us was everything that we thought we wanted when we started this process. So jumping forward into the development, we had these 3 pillars, and these are things that you've already heard about. So we wanted to make sure that hub locations were equitable. Everyone who responded to our RFQ was very interested in University Hill, Syracuse University, Upstate Medical, SUNY ESF. They were very eager to get a hold of the student population. But we wanted to make sure that this is spread out. This isn't just a novelty for folks on the Hill. We want to make sure this works for the city as a whole. So equitable hub locations, which feeds into economic inclusivity, which we were very upfront about from the get-go. We wanted this to be accessible and approachable regardless of how much disposable income you may have. So part of our system development was we worked through some numbers with our applicants, and again, Gotcha had the most approachable system pricing, which is the #1 reason why we chose them. And they did a lot of the work for us by offering to partner with local credit unions who are stationed in some of our community centers to get folks in there paying cash, get RFID cards in case you don't have a smartphone, all the things, again, that you would want to see in an equitable bike share program. And then we wanted this to be multimodal by design. We want this to pair with the bus network. We want this to be your last mile solution. We want you to use it for commuting. So all of those things were very important to us, and we didn't bend on them. Eventually, on our end, we forgot to think about the permitting process. So we've never had anything like this. How do we permit a private company to operate in the right of way in multiple locations? And we worked through it, but it's just one of those things that we weren't expecting, and it really caught up to us very quickly. And then the question that everyone had was, are these things even legal? Starting in 2017 and working through 2018, we were originally thinking of a standard bike share, and then we got shopped this e-bike, this electric pedal assist. And we had to work with our law department to assure them that, yes, this is legal because you have to pedal and there's no throttle. But these were questions that we had to answer over and over again for quite some time, even after system launch. So moving into the community engagement, again, we leaned on our community partners here for meetings, public events. You know, we gave folks Post-its and reached out on social media. We somehow convinced the mayor to talk about this in the state of the city and blasted that out. And we met with our community partners about where do they think mobility hubs should go? Where should the bikes go? And we had online surveys, we had analog surveys, you name it, we did it. We quickly learned that there was a fine line between someone who wanted to be a system sponsor and a community partner. So what I mean by that is folks who are interested in investing in the system because this is a third-party system, the city's putting forth no dollars. We expect this to be run by a third party. A system sponsor may be very interested in the system itself, but only if it's right outside their front door. And that may not jive with, back to our 3 pillars, setting up an equitable system. So we really had to work with that fine line and make sure that we weren't compromising, because there is definitely just a difference between a sponsor and a partner. And then after we answered are e-bikes legal, we got to the question of, what is an e-bike? What is the e-bike 101? Is it easy for me to use? Will I fall off it? Does it go too fast? How does this work for me as an end user? So that's the conversation we had time and time again. That's the one we still have. Fast forward a little bit to the launch. It was great. The launch was a huge success. We had a block party. We had food trucks. We had a band. We had safety events, free rides, prizes, games, you name it, it was there. And it was a grand time for all. We somehow convinced the mayor to ride in on one of our bikes with his staff behind him, also riding on the bikes. How we did it, I don't actually know. And we ended up having a literal ribbon cutting with the mayor and the CEO of Gotcha at the time, as well as one of our community partners' sons, who semi-willingly was forced into the middle of all of that to hold the big scissors. So again, everything you want to see in a launch event, we're building momentum. And immediately thereafter, major issues. The tech was not ready for prime time. There were app issues. There were ending your ride issues. There were multiple chargers. There were firmware issues. There were server crashes. You name it, it happened. And it kept happening. There were app updates. There were over-the-air waves updates. And nothing was really working. On top of that, supply chain issues. A lot of our supply chain was coming through China. If you've paid attention to the news, I don't blame you if you haven't. A lot of issues with the supply chain and trading with China. So it's just this, I want to say it's a trifecta, but it felt like an avalanche of just issues right from the get-go, as soon as we were all pumped up, riding high. And what this means was major features were delayed. Our low-income program was delayed. Our RFID card was delayed. Our dashboard for system metrics delayed, because all of the focus went on fixing the issues at hand. And I just want to point out that our launch event was so fun, even Otto showed up. Okay, so the doom and gloom, we're moving past it. The system rebounds. We have all the updates we need. We have new products. We have new firmware for the bikes. We ended up with a reduced fleet, but the fleet is working. We had extremely strong adoption and usage. And what I mean by that is hundreds of rides a day, thousands upon thousands of rides per month on a reduced fleet. The e-assist proved to be extremely popular. You heard earlier from Jen about how it flattens hills. That must be the #1 thing we hear from folks after they try it for the first time. They tell us it's easy, it flattens the hills, and they don't get to work all sweaty. Our ridership trends were exactly where we thought they would be. The bus transfer areas were really popular. We cited a lot of our hubs near major transit lines. This is a first mile solution, but also another player in our transportation network. Along the trails and bike lanes, that makes sense. Where there are bicycle facilities, people feel comfortable riding. But one outlier here that we were not expecting was the weekend trends. Our single most popular time for our bike share is weekend evenings, 8, 9, 10 o'clock. I'm not going to tell you folks are bar hopping on these bikes, but they're definitely having some fun Saturday, Friday evening. But on top of that, the commuting patterns really do dominate. That Monday through Friday, we see a broad swath of information that shows us folks are taking these to work in the morning and then home from work in the evening. So we've got our bike systems back up. We're flying high again. COVID hits. What does that mean for us? Again, immediate shutdown. We didn't know what the cleaning procedures needed to be. We wanted to make sure we had time to figure that out. We asked our partner, Gotcha, shut it down, and they did. We shut down for a few weeks, made sure all the cleaning procedures that were put in place matched the CDC guidelines. We had significant ridership reductions, which you heard from Les about earlier. There was a dearth there and sort of e-mobility as to be expected. But there were some stay-at-home adjustments made on our part and on Gotcha's part. We gave them the go-ahead to partner with local restaurants to assist with food delivery. It didn't prove to be as popular as we thought it would, but they did have some takers. The best thing we did was we relocated 3 hubs from downtown and around downtown out to some of the larger neighborhoods where there are larger neighborhood parks. And what that allowed for was the folks who were quarantined, staying at home, it gave them an opportunity to get out and exercise. And I use exercise kind of freely here because there's not a lot of exercise happening. There's not a lot of exertion when the bike has an e-assist. But we saw that the average trip length more than doubled up to 60 minutes. And we saw a transition from a transportation-focused, a commuter-focused ride to a leisure or a recreation ride, really focused around the parks. And so moving forward, this is where we find ourselves now. We're looking at a fleet replenishment this fall. The bikes are on their way. They've been shipped. We're going to increase the fleet. Originally, we were supposed to start with 200 bikes. We're down to about 100, and we'll be back up north of 200 once the replenishment is in. But more importantly, that gives our techs and our crews the spare parts that they need. That's something we never thought about. The fact that they had to Frankenstein bikes together because the supply chains were disrupted because most of the supplies were derived from China. So something we never thought of to begin with, but as we move forward, we're also looking at infill hub planning. The metric of one hub being walkable to the next hub is something that we also have tried to adhere to for the most part, and it works well. The RFID and Kickstart programs are currently in testing phase. And last but not least, the e-scooters loom large. And what I mean by that is something we know the vendor wants to push, something we know residents are interested in, something we know residents are already using if they purchase them themselves. In the state passing their legislation, as you heard about earlier, really opened the door for that. But one thing that we're not prepared to do here is allow e-scooters to enter our market until our bike share is properly functioning. And so just to summarize all these key points from SYRACUSE's experience with the e-bikes, some of the takeaways are double check the tech. If it sounds too good to be true, it might be. But any vendor that you encounter will more than likely be willing to allow you to ride the bikes, test out the apps, plug and play the system. How does it charge? What infrastructure is needed? You can have all of those things demoed for you, and I strongly suggest that you take advantage of that. Clearly define your objectives and stick to them. You heard about our 3 pillars. Equity is our top notion. make sure you stick to them, because any vendor will come in and sell you anything that they think you want to hear during that RFP process. But the important part is sticking it through and making sure that they deliver on those things, even if there are hiccups and even if there are delays. And last and not least, don't be shy about the fees and the revenue sharing. Again, if someone's using the public right of way to make private money, your city, your municipality, your county, you are entitled to a cut of that if that's something you want to pursue, and get it in the contract, because that's something that has proven to be an item that we can fall back on. And so that revenue sharing, we earmarked it for bike facilities. We said anything you give us has to go back into bike lanes. And that's something that people really like to hear. And so with that, I'll conclude my my presentation. I'd say I'd stick around after the presentation, but that's not quite how it works when we're digital, but we'll be here in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks, Neil. All right. And then, so finally, we've got Mitch LaRosa, who comes from a bit more of the operator supplier side of things. So Mitch, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all for having me today. Let me just give me a second here to get up. Just like Neil, am I, can everyone hear me? Can everyone see the screen? Good. So I'm Mitch LaRosa. I'm the program director here at Shared Mobility, Inc. We're a Buffalo-based nonprofit. We do work nationwide on the shared mobility spectrum, everything from car sharing and bike sharing to volunteer transportation, and now into this new exciting electric micromobility field. One thing off topic, I will preface, I have a puppy running around the apartment. So if anyone hears a squeaky toy or the like, it's his way of chiming in. So bear with me during that. He's 11 months old. But I'm really excited to speak to you all today, give a profile of our work, and talk about why this is so important for upstate New York. So a little of our history. We were founded in 2009 as Buffalo Car Share, which is the nation's first social equity focused shared mobility program. Our CEO, Mike Galagano, and our colleague, Creighton Randall, who's now at Mobility Development Partners, a close partner of ours in this space, founded it after grad school and worked for over 6 years to provide that service in Buffalo. And it was very, very community-focused work, very driven, and really a way that they wanted to expand an existing model in shared mobility and make that community-centric and serve needs in Buffalo. In particular, Buffalo suffers from a population that 30% of whom do not own a vehicle. So car share sort of key gap in the mobility spectrum there. In 2015, we transitioned the operation of those car sharing services to Zipcar and began focusing more on more broad space work. So our one key project we worked on during this time from 2015 to 2018 was a NYSERDA funded project to expand New York State's shared mobility networks. So we worked with communities all across the state, assessing their needs, hearing what they needed, and lending our experience to this. As Neil detailed, starting a shared mobility program can be challenging. There are oftentimes unknown variables and unknowns that you don't know as a community planner getting into, but we feel it's really our role as a key nonprofit in this space to help communities out and to lend that experience, because it's really important for the foundation of these programs to be done right. And if we feel that with that cooperation between the nonprofit sector, the public sector, and a lot of times the private sector as well, you can really create some great stuff in that field. So we worked on those projects for a few years. And we still maintain those connections as we move forward today. In the last couple of years, our work has turned more nationally focused. As I mentioned, Mobility Development Partners is a key sister organization of ours. And now we've begun taking the work we've started in New York State over the last decade and moving that on to the Midwest and the Chicago area and all over California as they expand shared mobility programs up there. And so that brings us to our current state today, where we are still helping communities out with these same initiatives, working on new stuff. But you know, as they say, the names and the faces change. You know, we've gone from car share to bike share, and now we're on to electric micromobility, which we think is a really important and key issue for us to focus on these days. But you know, not everything's all good here. It's not all peaches and cream. As you know, less detailed in some of his talk and sort of the background on this. There oftentimes can be challenges that are associated with this industry, and it's been well publicized over the last couple of years. You've seen plenty of articles, I'm sure, of scooters being stacked up, or in the dockless bike share craze, Lime bikes being thrown into various places they shouldn't be. So we really take it upon ourselves to try to flip that model on its head. These really private sector only driven models that doesn't include anything else can oftentimes not provide the community benefit that's needed out of these shared mobility programs. And so we take it upon ourselves as someone who works in this space to really help drive those issues and solve them for communities as they work towards these solutions. So in this particular sense, we're working on electric micromobility, or just EMM for short, because it's a handful to say that every time. And we classify these technologies in sort of 4 different ways. Primarily e-bikes and e-scooters. These are your typical 2 device classes like Les mentioned. Then you have the associated infrastructure, that's charging stations, other ports, or just docks for these devices. And then experimental technologies. I'm sure you've seen things like the one wheel people are riding around, or different types of technologies. EMM is still growing. It's definitely not a field that's capped off. And through our research and understanding of the field, we want to be open to those new technologies and new experiences, because what seems like something silly today could oftentimes be something that is a really key portion of equitable transportation tomorrow. And we don't know what that is, but as an organization that sort of sits at the nexus of research and implementation of these things, it's something that we really want to keep open to. So to support this work, we've been funded through NYSERDA to do a research and demonstration project with EMM technologies. As Jen mentioned, and all the details she gave about the legislation side, it saves me some time I don't have to go into. New York State, like we said recently, legalized these technologies, but there are years of best practices out there from different places, not all of which are focused on these small and mid-sized cities that really inhabit upstate. Most of these markets that tried the sort of dockless e-bike and the scooter crazes are definitely larger cities, and are places that the private industry targeted for their own first take at it. But there are still very important lessons that can be translated to small and mid-sized cities. And we really want to seek that out, understand those lessons, and then give them to community leaders and planners who can put them into action. So as part of this, we are doing demonstrations, just like Neil said. You can see up here in this picture, these are folks who are stakeholders with the city of Buffalo, who came out to a demonstration we hosted. What we do is we'll bring e-bikes and e-scooters out, get folks trying them, get some feedback for our project, but also educate them, talk about these technologies, talk about their potential, and talk about what these leaders need to be thinking about as these systems come front of mind. A lot of folks we've talked to are very interested in having these systems in their communities, have never ridden an e-bike or an e-scooter. And we really think it's important that if you're going to plan in this way and you're going to think about the implementation of these systems, you need to experience it firsthand as a way to get a better sense of what that would be like on the street. So it's been a really great experience over this summer being able to talk to, at this point, a little over a dozen communities throughout the state who have been interested in these technologies. And we've brought our devices out and spoken with them, hosted demonstration meetings alongside 2 public demonstrations for folks in the public to try. And now COVID's been a challenge for that. We have done our best to make sure we practice social distancing. You see everyone here is masked up, sanitizing the devices, sanitizing helmets, and creating a safe environment in which the public can experience these. Because just as policymakers haven't had the chance to engage with these technologies and experience them, the public hasn't either. And so instead of having large private operators just drop these devices everywhere, we really think it's important for folks to be engaged and educated about what these devices do and how to ride them. And hopefully by raising that awareness to this project, we'll be able to create some more sustainability in these systems and not see that big public backlash that turns into system stoppages and then back and forth about how to relaunch these systems. We want this to be a smooth process, and we think there's a good ground for that. And lastly, part of this project as well, we're partnered with the University at Buffalo School of Urban Planning to better understand the environmental impacts of these systems. When these do launch, we really are interested to see what will be the true greenhouse gas net benefit to our region, because they definitely have a great potential to do that. So it's an all-encompassing project, but NYSERDA has been very supportive of us, and we are kind of taking the same ride and drive model you've seen with electric vehicles and other projects we've worked on in this space to help raise this engagement. And so far, it's been a great success. We'll continue this project through next year, and we're still looking for more communities to do more outreach and demonstrations with. So as an aside, if you feel that you are interested in this and you're on the webinar right now, my email's at the end, please reach out, but we can circle back to that. So as part of this project, and almost as an aside to it, as Les mentioned, so with some of the industry changes, Uber dumped Jump onto Lime. And that left about 20,000 bikes in the lurch of their e-bikes, their top end e-bike model, the 5.5, which was they were all in West Coast operation. Otherwise, they would not have been given to anyone. So through our industry connections that we've cultivated over the last 10 years and the project we're working on with NYSERDA, we were able to secure 3,100 of those e-bikes that would have otherwise been scrapped and had them donated to us as part of this. So over the summer, we received these bikes over the course of a few months. It was about 30 tractor trailers worth, and you can see in the picture on the left. Took them all in, and we're now inventorying them as part of this project. So what started as a project to just raise engagement and hopefully give folks in the community planning space a path forward to launch these systems has sort of taken on its own sub-life of its own as we've engaged in this. And it's been a really great experience to work with these bikes so far. And you see in the picture before, they're actually the ones we use in the demonstrations, some of them we've gotten online. But this is turning into the basis for a whole new project for us. And one thing, as I've mentioned, we've done in our experience is we really focus on equity, really focus on community control in these systems. Those are two things that need to be front of mind for folks if you want to have good, functioning, equitable shared mobility programs in this space. And so the e-bike donation from Uber really gives us a great opportunity to think about how we can experiment not only with just the shared bike model in general, but also expand community transportation models into new communities. So we're using the e-bikes as a basis for what we're terming as transportation libraries. And the goal of ours is to create a system in which people can have free access to these e-bikes. And now that's a little nebulous, and it's a little, I'll be honest, a little ambitious as well. But the size and scale of this donation is unheard of. And it gives us a really great opportunity to think about this in a way that you really can't if you're just thinking about this from a simple operation standpoint or finding a private partner. Having 3,000 e-bikes and a nationwide list of partners who are interested really gives us some flexibility to try some new models and really experiment with what we have in this space. We're working with folks from all across the country, and I can get into that in the next slide, but the e-bikes themselves are in great condition. When these models came out, they were touted as one of the best e-bikes in the shared world. And basically, by and large, I'd say 95% of them are entirely solid. They just need a little tune-up and they're ready to go. So right now we are connecting here in Buffalo, across New York State through this NYSERDA project and nationwide about engaging with partners and how we can use these bikes to create increased mobility for disadvantaged communities. This is sort of flipping the whole private model on its head, where Uber would in previous times use these bikes to come into a city, drop them down, and maybe help write the legislation themselves almost. We think the process needs to be flipped. The community needs to be first. We need to have community-based nonprofits, community-based organizations helping us lead this charge to increase mobility. And we really want to figure that out. So while I don't have all the answers of what exactly that looks like in practice, there is certainly a lot of momentum going on in this space, and we're really excited for the work that we have ahead. So we can kind of group this into two sides of our work with this. On a national focus, we have a national steering committee we formed. This is led by the aforementioned Mike and Creighton from our team, as well as Obai Reed from Chicago and their slow roll, and runs an organization called Equiticity that's really focused on getting people of color involved in biking and bike sharing. So they have been great leaders in this. And we've actually convened a steering committee of a dozen other equity-focused planners and activists in the space that have helped us with this. We're currently underway with a nationwide RFI process that we want to initiate soon. So we want communities to come to us to say, hey, we are interested in this system. We can provide resources and support to make these libraries happen. Let's do something here. And we've actually engaged with folks from here in the Rust Belt, Midwest, and also out in California on some early stuff on that side. We're also pursuing national level funders to help sort of make that process work. Secondly, on the state level, like I said, we're using these bikes to power our demonstrations, get more people on e-bikes, increase that awareness. And so we are engaging interest from across the state on folks who want to partner in this space and want to be a part of this. Here in Buffalo, we are engaged in a process that's been funded by the local community foundation through a grant called Build Back Better that will help us engage with other folks involved in mobility justice that will help guide our process forward. Buffalo is probably the first market we'll see these libraries in because it's where we do a lot of our work still. I currently also operate the Ready Bike Share system, which is not electrified, so we won't talk about that today, but it relates to a lot of the work we're doing here, and it's probably where you'll see it first. But additionally, local funding is also needed, and we keep that front of mind as we look to develop and deploy this project. There we go. So in general, just to recap a lot of this, and I understand that covered a lot between our NYSERDA project, which is still ongoing, and the micromobility libraries work, but in general, it is a drive for our work to expand these systems. There are really three things that we think need to be front of mind for planners, for policymakers, and for other stakeholders involved in this. Forming public-private partnerships is really essential to making this work, and making this work in a way that can have models that expand, grow, but also be innovative. And we think that that's been a real key basis of our work so far, both in traditional bike sharing, but also in the work we're doing in this space now. And we think that's a general framework for good models to move forward with. Secondly, adapting funding sources that can help pay for this. So whether that's getting a turnkey solution that you can come in but still have a good amount of community control, like Neil mentioned, or other systems that build from the ground up that need funding and can help move these systems forward. It's something that's really going to help change the micromobility landscape, and something that's really essential to community controlled mobility in general. And then that transitions to my third point, where you need to have constant community input. You need to have folks on the ground who, like us, know how the systems work, but also are surrounded by folks who know how the systems work, who know how their community works, who know where you need to have transportation, where you need to expand options. Because knowing how to run the bike share, knowing how to run the scooter share it really should only be one piece of a much larger puzzle that increases community mobility for everyone. And transportation is a human right. We believe that strongly, and it's the work that we all do together on this that really makes that a reality. So like I said, my name is Mitch LaRosa, and if anyone here is interested in more about this jump bike stuff or wants to talk offline about demonstrations and things, my email is up here. Feel free, reach out. I would love to have those conversations with anyone.
Great, thank you, Mitch. And I see in the chat, Ithaca is interested in connecting with you, so make sure to get in touch with them. We do have a few questions that came through in the Q&A box. So I can start with some of these, and then if anyone else has questions, just feel free to throw them up in there. But one of the early questions that came in, I'll open this up to the group, is opportunities related to e-bikes, from anything from more secure parking, because maybe these are more expensive, bike highways, because we can go further, indoor and outdoor charging stations, and then just better bike infrastructure, particularly in retail and shopping areas, if e-bikes are better suited than non-e-bikes for shopping trips, for example. So I'll throw that out to anybody who might want to answer that.
So I'm happy to jump in. This is Neil Burke, and to some of these points, hopefully others will join me. But when it comes to things like bike parking and whether or not that's for e-bikes or regular bikes or however that is, having systems in place is really important, so that it's not a judgment call when it comes to the development meeting or the shopping center expansion. Having part of those items fleshed out in things like zoning codes and other requirements is very important. It also gives us, the reviewers, something to hang our hat on when we say, hey, we need to see 15 covered bike parking spaces here to match your 100-car parking lot. Hopefully it's less car parking than that. But in terms of whether or not you can charge them and how you charge them, I think that's a little bit of the chicken and the egg that, Jen had a great graphic on that earlier. It's what comes first here. And from our experience here in Syracuse, we saw that with charging for electric cars. And we went out and we got funding, and we worked with other partners to install chargers in and around some areas, especially as it relates to commuting patterns. But we found that they weren't very well used. And that might be due to siting, that might be due to maintenance, maybe the fees were too high. But one thing that we heard was folks they charge their car at night. and they make sure that they have the range to get to work and back. Whether or not bikes work that same way, I don't know. That's just an example of the things that we plan for now might not have the intended consequence later. But it's not to say that we don't pursue options for things like charging and better storage, especially when we're talking about very expensive pieces of equipment.
And I'll jump in on the like the bike highway idea. I know here in the Capital District, we recently adopted a regional trails plan, and like the idea of it was to be this seamless connected system, like an alternative highway for bikes and peds. So I think that, you know, and leveraging the huge investment of New York State in the Empire State Trail, a lot of communities in New York can start developing these plans and looking at that. As the trails get pretty crowded and busy, especially over the last few months with COVID, we've noticed a huge uptick in trail use. And we are starting to see like private e-bikes and e-scooters being used there. You know, there's talk about like, you know, planning for the third lane or widening some of these facilities to make sure that there still are safe spaces for everyone to use them. So I think that, you know, looking at trail planning and multi-use trails could be kind of that alternative highway system for bicycles, especially e-bikes.
Okay, thanks, guys. There's another question, and we just started to touch on this a little bit, but do we need to be thinking differently about private e-bikes and e-scooters versus shared systems in terms of what we're doing as planners?
I'll jump on that one. So I think it goes hand in hand. And just like you see traditional, just sort of normal bike adoption, as you see with standard bike share, so does e-bikes to private ownership of e-bikes. The difference is that a privately owned e-bike can be prohibitively expensive for a lot of populations. You're talking $1,500, $2,000 for a good model. And so while it's great from a general planning perspective, I think the infrastructure in terms of the right of way, as Neil and Jen talked about, has a lot of hand-in-hand exposure. It's important that we also consider that low-income populations may not be able to afford privately owned e-bikes, and that creating opportunities for affordable, accessible micromobility through shared systems could be a way to raise transportation equity patterns in any region. But I think that they go hand in hand. I can speak sort of anecdotally from some of these demonstrations we did. We set up on the Niagara River Greenway on Grand Island, New York, which is north of Buffalo, but south of Niagara Falls, and had our e-bikes and e-scooters out there. So we were out there for a few hours. We saw almost just as many e-bicyclists as we did conventional bicyclists. And a lot of those folks were older adults who wanted to keep biking. They wanted to bike for longer, but felt physically prohibited from doing so with a standard bike. And so that's really encouraging to see. I think it's really great to see that expanded. So I think they really go hand in hand in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. So we had a question looking at what's the smallest population size for shared mobility and I guess e-mobility in particular to be successful? So we've got a lot of small towns, right, in upstate New York. So can we do this stuff here?
I'll take this one again. I think it depends. It depends on your activity centers. It depends on the infrastructure you have around it. There are certainly plenty of small towns that come to mind when I think of bike share systems that are actually very successful. So Jackson Hole, Wyoming, Aspen, Colorado, a lot of smaller towns that have, frankly, recreation draws and thus get a lot of flows that way. From a smaller town's perspective, though, I don't think we've solved that. I think that's a really big gap in things here. I think it's fairly important for us to think about it. When you scale down bike share to a certain point, it almost becomes easier to do a quasi-library model or just a bike rental, because what creates the enormous costs and operation and sort of the headaches that Neil was talking about with these bike share systems is that there is a lot of tech. There is a shared network to run. And because of the GPS technology of these bikes and the operations that go around them, it's prohibitively expensive for small towns to get into. There's not a good economic model for it. But it's sort of like volunteer transportation that takes in that tangent. But what's the earliest forms of volunteer transportation? People had a car, you gave people a ride. That's been happening since the car was invented. Bike share is a growth of bike rental, and it's the sort of smart bike aspects of that put onto a whole system. So just because if you're a small town or you don't have the population or the recreation draws that some other places do, and you want to get into this, I don't think that it's necessarily impossible, but I don't think there's a well-worn path for it. And frankly, as someone in the space and who works here, I would love to help support that. I think there are models that really need to encourage that moving forward.
I just wanted to add that maybe looking at like the university and campus model, a lot of universities and campuses have their own shared bike share system. So, depending upon like the nature of the town or village, that could be a model to replicate.
Yeah, Jen brings up a great point. There are some very small college towns that have systems I know that are operated by the same operator that operates the same vendor that operates the Syracuse bike share. I believe there's one in New Rochelle, but it's really focused around the campus, and there's a couple of other good examples. But when it comes to very low population centers, maybe you don't have that captive audience that a college campus provides. It really becomes, in my opinion, crucial to flesh out your nodes. If you look at something like the Finger Lakes Wine Trail, would, for all intents and purposes, sounds like a great day trip on a bike. You go a little easy on the wine, but maybe get a water at each winery. But it's about sort of the infrastructure to get you there and back. And I think that's really the key player, which is the more expensive half of this coin when you're talking about bike sharing, getting people on these bikes. But it's probably the most important one, especially when you start leaving these larger population centers.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm thinking too, and maybe Mitch, you could speak to this, but you still need to go and round up the bikes, right? Assuming that people aren't going to bring them right back to the place where they got them. They're going to take them from point A to point B. So, in some ways, somebody's got to do that, whether that's voluntary or not. So I could see that as being a limitation.
Yeah, operationally and everything else with that. If you're only going to have one access point, it's kind of a bike rental. If people are going to bring it right back, the idea of a shared system is multinodal, is having a network that supports that. And so it's sort of that's where that library or just rental kind of thing comes in on that lower end. But that doesn't mean that if you're a small town, doesn't mean that just because you can't support a large bike share doesn't mean that infrastructure is not important. Doesn't mean safe streets aren't important. It doesn't mean that encouraging people to bike is not important. And the college model, as Neil and Jen mentioned, is very interesting on that. Albeit the captive audience out there is usually a little bit more attuned to it. But it's something that is interesting. I think that it still has a lot of growth to happen in small towns.
All right, thanks. We had a question about the potential for e-cargo bikes. And Jen, I'll lean on you as the legislative expert here, but is there anything in legislation that calls out e-cargo bikes in particular? And then I guess to the larger group, are you seeing anything in New York State and maybe to less looking nationally how e-cargo shared, I guess, e-cargo bikes might be working?
I mean, I'm definitely not a legislative expert, but I think that they would just be considered, it would depend upon like whether they have a motor or it's e-assist, and they would just be classified as class 1, 2, or 3. I am not familiar with systems that have cargo bikes. I think that like the long-term goal of these shared systems is to have different types of bikes and devices and vehicles available because, they help us close more gaps in the system. I've heard people talk about cargo bikes being a really great replacement for more car trips. And New York State has given a lot of, I don't know if anyone from New York State is on the webinar, but we've given a lot of rebates and money for electric vehicles. So, maybe seeing some sort of incentive for people to get e-bikes, private e-bikes, and also work them into shared systems could help.
Yeah, and just to add another quick point, in terms of planning your system, the space requirements for things like cargo bikes, adaptive cycles, recumbent bikes, the space requirements are a little bit different. So I think you would see a similar situation now where if you don't own a truck, but you need a sheet of plywood for your house, you can go rent a truck from the hardware store or the big box store. Cargo bikes seems likely they could follow a similar path where maybe you don't need it all the time, but if you really need to go get one, it might be more of a library or a direct rental as opposed to walking to your closest mobility hub and having there be a cargo bike always available.
Yeah, I'll chime in here a little bit. So this is kind of the next frontier of New York State law around electric micromobility. So there was a bill proposed by a Queens state senator to increase the legal allowance for bicycle width from 36 inches to 55 inches. You know, I mentioned some of those wonky requirements related to legality and classification of these vehicles. So that's one of them. There's this state level bill to permit wider cargo bikes. So currently they're constrained and that's limiting the practical application at the state level. So it's kind of in this legal gray area currently, I would say, similar to what Neil discussed when they were launching the gotcha program in Syracuse. And in terms of national and New York State level examples, I believe New York City is piloting an electric cargo bike program with some courier services. I think those include UPS and I think DHL and maybe even FedEx. And there's similar pilots going on, I believe, in Miami. So these have been tapped as an alternative for last mile package delivery in some urban centers. So we may, in the coming years, especially as the legality of these evolve, see similar e-cargo bike pilot applications, both among delivery companies and then in other applications as well in upstate New York. And there was one municipality, and I'm blanking on who it was, and it may have been in New York State that recently switched some of their municipally owned vehicles to electric cargo bikes to kind of help meet these sustainability goals in New York State and other states that have these really ambitious climate targets. So hopefully that law will get passed and we'll see more adoption of the electric cargo bikes for freight and other applications.
Yes. I'll open this up to all of you. So, you know, say the people in the audience who are with municipalities or who are planners otherwise, and they might want to launch an e-micromobility program, you know, coming in the spring, summer 2021. So what should we be doing now to start getting ready for that? You know, we've talked a bit about plot pilots. It sort of sounds like places are choosing to do e-bikes before e-scooters and sort of test the waters. But what is it that we could be doing now if we're looking to get into this stuff when it gets warm again?
So I can speak to that as someone who's working very closely with a lot of communities who are thinking about these things. I obviously, if you are interested, I think demoing is a great way to start. Obviously, I'm sort of promoting ourselves a little bit here, but having folks that are interested in this, key stakeholders, key policymakers get on these devices and understand how they work and what they feel like should be, you know, step one. And then talking to community leaders, talking to folks who are, you know, involved in transportation in your area, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. No two communities are the same. And that was something that we really felt was good about our state legislation, is that because it's governing the state that obviously has mobility challenges that are incomprehensible between New York City and downstate and upstate cities up here, how do you write a piece of legislation that works for everything? And you don't. But you write something that is open-ended, that can have good community control and can be changed and altered as necessary to meet whatever you have going on in your local level. So taking that into account, taking stock of what you have in your community and what works best. You know, I know you mentioned e-bikes over e-scooters in sort of a first step case, but it can be whatever. It can be whatever whatever community leaders feel is going to work best. And so I think sort of taking a look in the mirror and taking stock of what you have and and being able to experience that, I think are really good first steps. And then plotting out, what are your steps towards sustainability? Who would run this system? What's going to make this work? How is this going to get past just a demo and a pilot into being something sustainable? So it's a step-by-step process, but I think the earlier communities can ask these questions, and this is better, sooner rather than later.
Clear, not just to the company or the individual who may offer or own that device, but to everyone else as well, so that you can avoid some of the pitfalls that happened the first time around. It pays not to be first with some of this stuff. So when it comes to dockless scooters and things like that, there are lessons to be learned that you don't have to deal with if you're just joining the arena now.
Yeah, and Jen, and maybe Les, are there, and I know there are, but maybe you can point us to some resources for writing regulations at the municipal level, maybe some, examples even from outside of New York State, but, I'm just imagining, a smaller town or village who wants to do this, but just really has no idea. Yes, we've got the New York State legislation, but maybe we don't want e-scooters, but we want to try out some bikes. What are some good resources for the regulation side of things?
So I found that the Shared Use Mobility Center has really great resources. They have lots of model language, how to do permitting, where to and how to designate both use, operation space and parking spaces, how to require safety, whether it's like on an app that's maintained by the operator or, doing safety in other capacities. So I found a lot of really good model language there. And again, you could Google the Shared Use Mobility Center, or if you go to New York State Association of MPOs website, we have a shared mobility page where we link to that. And then also NACTO. NACTO has some great guidance on shared mobility. Les, I don't know if you have any other recommendations.
Yeah, I think I would largely echo your recommendations. There have been some good model language developed by San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. The city of Seattle also developed some good language, but I think the Shared Use Mobility Center resource you mentioned is probably a really good starting point.
All right, thanks, guys. Let's see, I'm not seeing any other questions come up in the chat. To the panelists, was there anything else that you wanted to touch on that you didn't get a chance to in your presentations? I'll give you that time here. Otherwise, Neil, I did. Hi. Let me try that again. To Neil, with the new state legislation, did the city of Syracuse have to change anything or do anything different? Or were you guys pretty much okay?
Fortunately, no. We snuck in under the radar with the fact that these bikes had a very limited speed, and also that they're pedal assist. So there was no throttle. They weren't, it wasn't an electric moped. It didn't fall into any gray category once we started digging. However, in the beginning, we were definitely very nervous about pending state legislation that took a very long to come to fruition, but then figuring that out and then seeing what the state recently passed has only given us a bit more guidance here on what we want to do moving forward.
All right, so that's good. So maybe look at Syracuse as a model too, especially because it's in New York State, right? So, all right. So last call for any questions from our audience members. And if not, we'll be sure to share any contact info if you want to get a hold of any of our speakers. But I think I will turn it back over to Dan just to wrap up and close us out today.
Yeah, that sounds good. Great job, everybody. So that does conclude today's session. I'd like to thank the presenters again, Lisa, Jennifer, Les, Neil, and Mitch, and my co-host, Jesse. I'd also like to thank the CDTC, Capital District Transportation Committee, for sponsoring the session. And finally, I'd like to thank the attendees who have joined us today. We hope you have a good rest of the conference. And just for some housekeeping things, again, the CM credit number is 920-5087. And a recording of this will be emailed to you once it becomes available. And then the next session is Wednesday, October 14th, titled Investing in Social Cohesion to Create More Resilient Communities. So we look forward to seeing you guys then. And thanks again, everybody.